and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yong Ki-hong, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today's webinar will focus on TN visa sponsorship and requirements. I will be covering the first half of the session, and then our firm's another senior associate, Dustin Saldariaga, will take over the second half. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full service immigration law firm and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our excellent work with the TN visas, and we have built a very strong reputation in this area. We have processed hundreds of TN visas, and many of them were very complicated cases. And we have worked with many employers who did not have any experience with the TN visa processing. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you could download the guidelines with more details on visa options, and a link to sign up for additional webinars, and a link to the webinar recording on YouTube. We definitely encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link you could sign up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into the chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So TN visa requirements. So TN visa is probably the best working visa for Canadian or Mexican nationals, well, except those who wish to run their own businesses in the United States. Let's look at the requirements. First, you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico, but please note that you do not need to be born in Canada or Mexico. You just need to have a passport from one of these two countries. Your profession must be one of the listed occupations in the TN visa regulations. For this matter, if you are at your computer, then please go to Google and type NAFTA TN regulations, NAFTA, or TN, just simply TN regulations, or simply TN occupation list. Any of them works. And then you may click on any link that shows up the list of TN visa occupations. Well, I'll click the first link that came up from my Google search page. And once you click on that and scroll down, you will see a list of occupations, and starting with the accountant, architect, and there are a total about 60 occupations listed. As you can see, even though many commonly well-known occupations are listed here, you should also note that there are some professionals not listed here. An example would be a marketing related positions. So point is, TN visa is not covering whole industries. So please remember that your profession must appear on the list in order to apply a TN visa. You must also have the required qualification to practice the profession. And when I said that you need to have a qualification, it is not the U.S. employer's requirement for the job. Well, for example, a U.S. employer may require the job applicant to have 20 years of job experience for a particular position. But that's not the case for the TN visa application. All you need to do is just meet the TN visa's minimum requirement. So for example, economist, from the list that you are currently looking at, that needs a bachelor's degree or licentiature degree, Accountant needs a bachelor's degree or licentiate degree or CPA license. Management consultant needs a bachelor's degree or licentiate degree or 5 years experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. Likewise, you have to carefully review which occupation you are going to use and apply for your TN visa, because each occupation has a slightly different way to meet the requirement. Another requirement is a pre-arranged job offer from U.S. employer. So you must have a job offer from the U.S. employer first in order to apply for the TN visa. But please note that the definition of employer is quite broad. It could be a solo proprietorships, LLC, or usual incorporations, whatever. So this means your U.S. employer does not have to be really fixed corporation form. An individual employer could give you a job offer, and you may still get an approval for the TN visa as long as other requirements are all met. However, please keep in mind also that you cannot use your own U.S. company. Canadians and Mexicans could establish their own corporations in the States. However, you cannot give a job offer from your own company to yourself. That's it. That's kind of prohibited. Self-employment is prohibited for the TN visa. Your degree also must match the job descriptions. It means you need to show that you are coming to the United States to perform the activities matching with your profession. An example is that, like, let's say you are a US company wants to hire you as a social media manager, and you have a bachelor's degree in accounting. In that case, because proposed job duties as a social media manager is not really matching with what you learn from your school in your major accounting major, in that case you may not be eligible for the TN visa. Okay. Next. Then how do we know what kind of job duties a particular TN occupation actually perform? For that matter, you should look at Department of Labor's Occupational Outlook Handbook. In short, we call it OOH in the U.S. immigration law. If you search a particular occupation from this website, and then click on what they do, then you will see the most commonly performed job duties by the occupation. Likewise, whatever occupation you are applying, you should always check this website to make sure that the job duties you are going to perform in the United States is always substantially matching with the information provided OOH. Dustin will address this OOH website one more time when he takes over this presentation later, so it may be a good idea keep this website open in your computer. Then what is sponsorship in terms of TN visa? This is one of the most commonly asked questions when we do the TN consultations. So in the US immigration, the definition of sponsorship often means the employer needs to test the labor market, whether there is another US worker willing to take this job, or employer need to pay prevailing wage, which is usually a lot higher than state minimum wage in many situations. The responsibility of sponsorship sometimes even extends to the situation where employment is terminated. For example, when an employer lays off an H-1B employee, the employer needs to pay a transportation fee so that the H-1B employee can go back to the home country. The good news is that the TN visa does not require any of this. So for that reason, you could say TN visa does not require any sponsorship. The TN visa, for the TN visa, you just need a valid job offer from US employer and signed letter explaining that the nature of position and job duties, employment duration, and salary amount. That letter is not binding though. It's not like a contract that you have to be really bound by. If the applicant turns out to be not a good worker, then employer has a right to terminate the employee anytime. And the employer also has the same right to quit the job anytime if he does not like it. So basically, TN visa worker is almost identically treated as a US worker. Filing for TN visa can be made at the port of entry for Canadians, or at the same time, if preferred, then the application can be submitted to the U.S. Embassy as well. But Mexicans need to submit the application to U.S. Embassy. But keep in mind that when you are already inside the United States and wish to file a change of status through the USCIS, then you could submit TN visa application to the USCIS, and it can be done without going out from the United States. With that in mind, let me turn it over to Dustin, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation, and who will cover the differences between Canadian and Mexican nationals, as well as some more eligibility and challenging TN categories. So please stay tuned.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Yankee. So I am really just going to build off of what Yankee has already shared with you all. As mentioned, both Canadians and nationals of Canada and Mexico can apply for a TN visa. The requirement is that they actually hold that passport, not that they actually be born there. However, the process is slightly different for nationals of Canada and Mexico. Specifically, nationals of Canada have an additional way to apply for a TN status. So let's get into the options. Let's start with what that option is. So for Canadians, they can actually get TN status at a port of entry. So that is either a land crossing, an airport, and they would basically present their TN application to the border official there. They'd have a brief conversation with the border official, and if they're approved in their passport, they would get a stamp saying TN, and with a validity period, they would not actually get a sticker in their passport. They would not get a physical visa. They would instead get that passport stamp. And usually that passport stamp will also say what period, so up to typically up to a 3-year period that they would have that TN status. So that option is available only for nationals of Canada. Applying at a port of entry is only available for nationals of Canada. The other two options to apply for TN status or a TN visa are available to both Canadians and Mexicans. And those are, first of all, applying at a consulate. So nationals of Canada or Mexico can apply at a consulate abroad. For nationals of Mexico, if they are outside the U.S., this is their only option to apply for a TN visa. For nationals of Canada, really the only reason, the most common reason why they would apply at a consulate is if they have a spouse or a child who does not have a Canadian passport. Because applying at a port of entry is only an option if you have a passport from Canada. So if you're married to someone, say who's a permanent resident of Canada but has an Indian passport, they would have to apply at the consulate. And as a result, oftentimes the Canadian principal, the primary applicant, would join them at the consulate. But otherwise, because the option of applying at a port of entry is so fast, so easy, so inexpensive, that is almost always what a national of Canada would choose. So, what is the third option that's available which is available to both Canadians and Mexicans? It's applying from within the U.S. through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And that is an option that is, in general, only available if you're already inside the U.S. So let's say you are a national of Mexico, you're a student studying accounting, and you get a job offer from a U.S. employer to work as an accountant. The TN visa may be a very good option for you to consider. And if you're already in the U.S. on an F1 student visa, what you would do if you didn't want to apply at the consulate in Mexico is to apply through USCIS for a change of status from F1 to TN status. That option does happen with some frequency. The pros of applying through USCIS are that you don't have to travel, you don't have to leave the US. The cons are it is generally more expensive. There's a filing fee, especially if you want to expedite the application. USCIS does offer a 15 business day expedited option, but it is almost $3,000 for that expedite option, so it is not cheap. But if you wanted a sense of whether your application will be approved, you can apply through USCIS while you're still in valid status. Say you're in valid F1 status and applying to TN. Your U.S. employer, prospective employer, could file that TN application. And if you're denied, it would not impact your underlying status. So applying through USCIS could be a good option there. Otherwise, we do typically see that nationals of Mexico are going to apply at a consulate in Mexico. They're going to have a visa. They're going to be able to come into and out of the U.S. based on that visa. And nationals of Canada are going to apply at a port of entry because it really is just so fast and so easy to pursue that option. One final note is that in general, nationals of Canada, the visa is going to be issued for 3 years. Nationals of Mexico actually have the option of getting a 4-year TN visa. They do have to pay an additional fee for that, but because it is so convenient, that is oftentimes what we will see nationals of Mexico pursue. Now, the visa validity is different from TN status. So regardless of whether you have a TN visa for 1 year or for 4 years, each time you enter the U.S., you are generally given 3 years of TN status when you enter the U.S. And that is what controls how long you can stay in the U.S. It's very important to check your I-94, which is a form that shows the period of your status and what status you have each time you enter the U.S. Because it is largely completely independent of your visa validity period. All right, we can go to the next slide. So Yongki mentioned the TN regulations, which are really, fortunately, they're very clear, first of all, but also they're very detailed, which is why in these presentations we actually talk about the regulations. We don't usually mention regulations when we talk about other visa categories like the E2 or green cards, because regulations can get very complex. They can also be confusing, but in the context of the TN visa, they actually are very helpful. So as Yongki mentioned, the TN regulations list out dozens of professions, and you do need to fall under one of those professions to apply for a TN, and not all of those professions are equally easy or difficult to be approved for. In particular, there are 2 particularly difficult TN professions. One is management consultants, and the other is economists. And these are difficult for completely different reasons, and we'll go through why on this slide. So let's start with management consultants. The unique thing about management consultants is that this is one of the few professions where the government does not require a degree. For almost every other TN profession, you either need proof that you have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or you have a professional license that in itself usually will require a degree. So if someone does not have a college degree, then they are pretty much limited to the management consulting category in most cases. As a result, the government knows this. They know that this is a catch-all category for people who don't necessarily meet the requirements for management consultants, but they are applying just because they don't qualify for any other, and so they scrutinize this category very closely. Now, one thing that's very important to know about this category is that not all management consultant applications are challenging. The applications that are not challenging, that are not risky, are those where you are applying to work for a management consulting firm in the US. So let's say that you are working for a consulting firm in Mexico City. Let's say you're working for McKinsey in Mexico City, and you're applying for a TN visa to work for McKinsey in New York City. that is not going to be a challenging application because you're working as a management consultant for a management consulting firm. The applications that are very difficult are when you're applying for a management consultant TN and you're not going to be working for a management consulting firm in the US. So the example I like to use is, let's say that there's a national of Mexico who is an expert in the design and manufacture of solar panels. And a US company that makes and manufactures and designs these solar panels wants to hire this person so that the US company can make its process more efficient. So in that example, you have a US company that is not a management consulting firm. It makes solar panels. However, the national of Mexico, would be coming to the US to advise the company on a challenge, so they would be acting as a management consultant. So that application would be challenging, but how would you frame the application so that it has a higher likelihood of being approved? Really, the fundamental thing to keep in mind is you want the application to really reflect what a management consulting arrangement looks like. So what do I mean by that? If a company is hiring McKinsey, they are not going to be putting the McKinsey consultant on full-time payroll as a W-2 employee, as a client of McKinsey. Instead, what they're going to have is a management consulting agreement where they are paying McKinsey, or they're paying the consultant as a contractor for services that the consulting company or the consultant is providing to the client company. So you have a management consulting agreement. You're typically paying them as an independent contractor. You're usually in the management consulting agreement laying out what the deliverables are and how the consultant's going to be paid. Maybe for the first 3 months, they're going to evaluate the client company. In our example, the manufacturing process and the design process. Maybe in the next 3 months, they're going to be providing recommendations. And then in the following 3 months, they're going to be monitoring to witness the implementation of those recommendations. So that is what a typical management consulting agreement looks like. You want your TN application to reflect that. So that is why you see on your screen, unless the applicant's coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. That's where you're not filling a full-time role at the client company. You're not a W-2 employee. You are, generally speaking, a contractor who's providing services according to the management consulting agreement. Also in these applications, it's really important to define what the U.S. company is, what they do, what the challenges that they're facing, and why the applicant is ideally suited to address those challenges. So in our example, you define very clearly the U.S. company is struggling with high manufacturing costs of their solar panels. The applicant is an expert in the design and manufacture of solar panels based on a long, experience and certain accolades they've received. And they're coming to the U.S. to help with this specific challenge. So you really want the application to make that very clear. The next category that's uniquely challenging is that of economists. The reason why the economist category is challenging is because the government issued a policy memo in November 2017 that says it's a new policy memo. It is not. It is 9 years old at this point. And basically what that policy memo said was that the government is limiting what it thinks economists do. Specifically, economists do not perform the job duties of financial analysts and market research analysts. So what does this mean for you? This means if you are applying as an economist for a TN visa, you need to spend time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, which Yankee mentioned, which is the government's publication, official publication, where the government details what it thinks certain professions do. And what you need to do on the Occupational Outlook Handbook is look at how the Occupational Outlook Handbook defines the job duties of economists, and you want to make sure your job duties are aligned with those job duties. If the U.S. employer wants you doing things that are not aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook's economist webpage, you want to talk with the employer. Make sure they can align those job duties so that they are closer to what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says economists do. And that is actually what you need to be doing in the US. This is not just an exercise to get an approval. You actually need to be making bona fide, legitimate claims about the job duties you'll be doing in the US. At the same time, while you're looking at the job duties of economists and what you do need to be doing in the US, look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook's page of job duties for financial analysts and for market research analysts, because those are the job duties that you do not want to be doing. If your job duties closely reflect those of financial analysts or market research analysts, the government is likely to deny your application because they're going to say you are actually working as a market research analyst rather than an economist, or a financial analyst rather than as an economist. In general, and I should have mentioned this before, but the distinction, economists are really using economic data. They can advise private companies, but they are really using econometrics, statistics to evaluate economies and markets. Conversely, financial analysts primarily are looking at opportunities for their employer to make profits from investments. Market research analysts are primarily working in marketing, looking at opportunities to sell more products or advertise their products or services. But do spend time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook because, of course, there are more details that go into that distinction. And if you're looking at the economist category, you really do want to understand that distinction very well. We can go to the next slide. All right, I mentioned before what the TN visa application process is in general when I was talking about how Canadians have an option that nationals of Mexico do not, which is to apply at a port of entry. But let's go into a bit more detail. So in terms of that option, applying at a port of entry, Canadians, what they would bring with them to the port of entry is a packet of documentation that is very similar to what would be provided at the consulate or to USCIS. So the TN application packet really does, the bulk of it is the same regardless of how you're applying, but the process of applying is different. So let's talk a little bit about what that application looks like. So Canadians applying at a port of entry, what they are going to have, typically, the most important document in a TN application is going to be a letter from the U.S. employer where the employer defines who they are, who the applicant is, the prospective employee, how the applicant qualifies for the TN. So that's going to be either they have a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree, or they have a professional license, or they have experience. And again, that's going to be dependent, as Yankee mentioned, on the regulations. If you're applying as an accountant, you cannot depend on experience. If you're applying as a management consultant, you can use experience. So you really have to look at what is the profession I'm coming to the U.S. to fill, and that's based on my job duties, and how do I qualify based on the TN regulations. And I make that distinction, qualifying based on the TN regulations, contrast that to qualifying based on what the U.S. employer wants. So let me give you an example. If you are applying as an accountant and the U.S. employer wants an accountant with 20 years of experience, that's fine. The U.S. employer can require that. But in your TN application, you're not going to say, I qualify as a TN accountant because I have 20 years of experience. Because if you do that, the government is going to look at the regulations and they're going to see, well, the only way to qualify as an accountant is to have a degree or a professional license. And you're telling me you have 20 years of experience, and that's not a basis you can qualify as an accountant, so you're denied. So what you want to do is in the application, in the employer letter should make it very clear. We want to hire this person. They qualify for the TN as an accountant because they have a degree. And the application packet is going to include that degree. It's fine for the employer letter to also say, we also want them to join our company because they have 20 years of experience and we value that experience. But it's very important that that not be the basis for qualifying for the visa. All right, so what else is going to be in the employer letter? It's going to talk about who the employer is, who the prospective employee is, the applicant, how the applicant qualifies for the TN. as well as what the job duties are going to be in the U.S. And that's really critical that the letter define what the job duties will be, because those job duties need to be consistent with the Occupational Outlook Handbook and how it defines the role. If you are coming to the U.S. to work as an accountant because you have an accounting degree, but your U.S. employer really wants you developing their social media campaigns, you're looking at a denial, because the employer letter is going to say you're going to be working on social media campaigns. That is not what an accountant should do according to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So the employer letter is really where you have that alignment between the job duties you'll be doing and the Occupational Outlook Handbook. The employer letter is also going to talk about how much you'll be paid, and that amount should be consistent with what people in the role are typically paid. You can find that on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, as well as the period of time that you're requesting TN status. That's usually 3 years. There are some situations where it would be shorter. An example is management consultants. A 3-year engagement for a management consultant is pretty long. So oftentimes what we do is we try to reduce that period. We work with our clients to figure out how long do you actually need to accomplish the goal that the U.S. company needs to accomplish, and the TN application would reflect that. So usually a year, maybe 2 years in a management consultant role. So in addition to the letter, you do need proof that you qualify based on the TN regulations. So if you're qualifying based on a degree, you need that original degree. If you're qualifying based on a related degree, so let's say you don't have an accounting degree, but you have a degree in finance, or you have a degree in math, then you would have your transcript in addition to the degree, and you show your transcript and how you actually took classes related to, for example, accounting. You do need a certified copy of your transcript. If you're qualifying based on experience, say as a management consultant, you do need original signed letters from past employers talking about that experience. I should have mentioned before that the employer letter also needs to be original, have the original signature, and needs to be on the U.S. employer's letterhead. So those are really the primary components of a TN. The employer letter, proof of how you qualify, and of course your passport. And again, that is at a port of entry. That packet is going to be very similar to what a national of Mexico or a national of Canada would submit to the consulate. They would bring exactly the same documentation that I just described to their consular interview. Before they're scheduled for an interview, they would submit what's called a Form DS-160. It's an online form. They'd submit that to the consulate, and then the consulate would schedule them for an interview. And again, at that interview, they'd bring the same packet of information that I described before, all original documents. If you're applying through USCIS, there are a few distinctions. One is that the U.S. employer would file what's called a Form I-129, and in that application, along with that form, they would submit copies of the documents I described before. So copies of the employer letter, copies of the diploma or the professional license or the experience letters, copies of your passport. And again, that application would be submitted by the U.S. employer. So the benefit of that is that if the application is denied, it is the employer's denial. It is not your personal denial. And you would be able to continue the status that you already have in the U.S., assuming your I-94 continues to be valid. But that is really the distinction with USCIS. All right, we can go to the next slide. And some tips and common pitfalls. Yankee and I have mentioned these throughout the presentation, but some of these. But let's go through some real key recommendations that we've learned from our experience. The first is that it's always a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry before you show up. And I'm referring here to port of entry if you're Canadian. So you're applying at a port of entry as a Canadian national. It's good to call ahead just to make sure you know what the hours are of the port of entry, that they are accepting TN applications, whether they need an appointment beforehand, if there's a specific procedure. You can find the phone number on the Customs and Border Protection website. Never hurts to call ahead. Next, it's a good idea to make sure that the person who signs the employer letter is available at the time you are actually speaking with the government official, whether that is at a port of entry or at a consulate. And the reason is that sometimes the government official will actually call the person who signed the letter just to make sure that the role is legitimate. This doesn't happen often, but it does sometimes happen, so it's good to be prepared for it. Um, the the reason why they sometimes do this, and this is important to keep in mind, is that Customs and Border Protection, as well as consulates, they both encounter a lot of fraud, a lot of fake documents. And so to preempt that, always bring original documents with original signatures, and do ask that the person who signed be available, just because they might verify that by phone. All right. Very closely related to the next bullet, bring diploma, official transcripts, the original diploma, official transcripts, and original signed version of the employer letter if possible. The employer letter should be on the employer's official letterhead. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. It is not a green card. It is a temporary visa. So sometimes the government will want proof of your ties to either Canada or Mexico so that they're reassured that you actually do plan to leave at the end of your TN. This can be in the form of copies of bank statements that you have abroad. If you own property abroad, if you have children who attend school abroad, whatever it is, it's good to have that documentation with you, but frankly, the government will very rarely ask for this if it's your first or second TN. If it's your third, fourth, fifth TN, they might ask for that, but usually not if it's your first or second. And keep in mind, the TN can be renewed indefinitely as long as you and the U.S. employer remain eligible. So even though this is not a permanent resident green card, you can renew it as long as your intention is ultimately to return to your home country. We can go to the next slide. All right. If you have any last minute questions, go ahead and send them in. I think we did address everything that came up. Yankee, thank you, and thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us today. Feel free to schedule a consultation if we can be of any help in the future.
Thank you.